is Thursday, May 5th. I'm KJ, and every Thursday night you'll find me here at 8:30 p.m. on YouTube at Metro Conservative Media. Please hit the subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. At the same time, I'm also live on Facebook at the Metro Conservative Media Facebook page. As you know, we are trying to get our videos to a broader audience and recognized all over Maryland, and for that matter, the country. The only way that happens is if you subscribe. So drop a like right now and comment. You can do that on YouTube and Facebook. Also, join the conversation. We will respond to your comments throughout the show. This is a show where I chat with various individuals about the important issues that directly impact our communities. Today is actually Israeli Independence Day, and my guest tonight is Andrew Koch. Is it Koch or Koch? I meant to ask you that, Andrew Koch. He is the treasurer of the Maryland Republican Jewish Council. How are you tonight?
Thank you, KJ. Good evening, and Chag HaTzvut Sameach, everyone. Today is a great day for the Jewish communities of the world, and also supporters of Israel around the world who don't necessarily have to be Jewish.
All right, excellent. And your last name, how do you pronounce that? I want to make sure I have that correct.
Like the late former mayor of New York.
Okay, all right. So before we get into, as we mentioned, we're going to talk about how the state of Israel has been a force for good in the world. Also, we're going to talk about opposing viewpoints here in the States and much more. So again, thank you for joining me. Before we get into all of that, I always open up the night or our conversation with a fun kind of question and answer, get to know you game. So basically, it's a rapid fire round of questions, and you answer as quickly as you can with the first thing that comes to your mind. All right, are you ready?
Go ahead.
All right. So what are you most known for amongst your friends?
Basically, I'm most known for my knowledge of sports. A lot of my friends in high school were on different sports teams. One of my best friends actually played here in Baltimore. He played for the Orioles for 6 years, and now he's a coach out in San Diego. And I went to his wedding down in Florida back in 2016.
So that's what you know for about sports.
Yes,
Okay.
Knowledge of sports and having a sharp wit.
Okay. All right. And so speaking of that, are you extroverted or introverted?
I would say more introverted.
Okay. And what quality do you value most in your friends?
I value honesty and just commitment. Staying in touch with friends. I know I mentioned my friend who's now a coach in Major League Baseball. I actually met up with him a few months ago while I was on vacation in Florida, and he was still home because of the lockout of Major League Baseball. So I was able to catch up with him while I was down in Florida, and he's also, again, I have friends reach out to me on my birthday. I reach out to them. So it's about basically remembering who your friends were and where you came from.
Okay. In 3 words or less, what is the number one issue facing Baltimore today?
Crime, life quality.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Biggest misconception about Judaism?
We don't control all the money in the world. We don't control the media of the world, and we certainly don't control the politics of the U.S. or any other country.
That's a good one. Okay. All right. You had to choose one or the other, homeschool or public school?
Well, this is an interesting one. I went to public schools growing up, but seeing how public schools in Baltimore City is probably the most egregious example of this, seeing how they've deteriorated to the point where they're teaching students about ridiculous concepts, such as if you're one race, you're a racist and oppressor, and if you're another race or religion, you're oppressed and can never advance in life. Instead of teaching kids how to read at or above grade level, teaching kids how to do math at or above grade level, and the results are showing for themselves. So I would say at this point now, I would, if I had kids, I would probably send them to private schools.
Oh, private. Okay. All right. And if you could meet anyone past or present, who would it be and who would it be? Just who would it be? Mm.
And it would actually be the only woman who has ever served as the Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir. Okay. Golda Meir was Prime Minister of Israel from the late 60s through the early 70s. She was originally from Hungary, then emigrated to America. She grew up, also lived for many years in Milwaukee before emigrating to Israel. And again, she's been the only woman to ever serve as Prime Minister of Israel. And what actually led to her downfall was how she responded to the invasion by Syria and Egypt in the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Her government did not have an adequate response to that, and that's what ended up leading to her downfall as prime minister.
Oh wow! All right. Well, that was our just fun random question and answer round, so just the audience can get to know you. All right. So I want to get into the bulk of our conversation tonight, which is today. Today is, as I mentioned earlier, Israeli Independence Day. So can you talk about what that is, or how did that come about?
Well, there are a couple of critical events that led up to that. So let's go back in time, almost 75 years ago now, to the fall of 1947. And there was a debate held in the United Nations General Assembly about partitioning British Mandate Palestine. What was then known as British Mandate Palestine was a part of the British Empire from 1917 up until 1948. So ultimately, the United Nations General Assembly voted to partition what was then known as Palestine under the British Mandate into territories for a Jewish state and also territories for an Arab state. And of course, in that part of the world, in the Middle East and North Africa, all the other countries were majority Muslim nations. And we have to remember, 1947, we're only not even 3 years removed from the end of World War II and the ashes of the Shoah, the Holocaust, which was the Nazis' reign of terror and attempted extermination of the Jewish people in Central and Eastern Europe. So the UN voted to partition British Mandate Palestine and create the State of Israel in 1947. The British started pulling out of it, what we now know as Israel, in the spring of 1948. April of 1948, they actually started pulling out of northern Israel, and I've seen the scars of this transition myself, the scars of the British pulling out, and then the Syrians, among others, other members of the Arab League, attempting to immediately crush the new Jewish state. So the British pull out. The British Mandate officially ends at midnight on May 15th, 1948, and the first Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, who is a prominent figure in Israel, you'll see a lot of streets, the airport in Israel, the biggest airport in Israel is named for him. There's a university in southern Israel that's named for him. He announced to the world from Independence Hall in Tel Aviv, "We hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in the land of Israel to be called the State of Israel."
Now, wait a minute. You said May 15th.
May 15th, 1948, which corresponds with the 4th of ER 5708 on the Hebrew calendar. So because it's on the Hebrew calendar, which is a lunar calendar, it moves around. It's not always on the same day. I'll get back to May 15th in a moment and how the Arab world observes that day. So May 15th, 1948, corresponding with the 4th of ER 5708 on the Hebrew calendar, David Ben-Gurion declared Israel's independence. And immediately after that, even after citizens of Israel were celebrating and dancing in the streets, the members of the Arab League immediately started an attack in an attempt to immediately wipe out the State of Israel. So Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, etc., members of the Arab League invaded Israel. So Israel couldn't even enjoy its new status as a new independent country. It had to immediately fight a war to survive.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Wow. And so how is the day celebrated in Israel and here, for a matter of fact? How is it celebrated?
Well, KJ, as we both know as Americans, common ways to celebrate our Independence Day on 4th of July. We have friends over for cookouts, we go to pool parties, go to the beach, go to lakes, etc. In Israel, people celebrate very much the same. Grilling is a popular activity, going to the beach is a popular activity, especially in Europe, if in Tel Aviv and Yafo. That's a popular spot to go watch the Air Force put on its annual Independence Day flyovers over along the beaches of Tel Aviv and at the port of Yafo. People will go out and hike in different parts of the country,
Mm-hmm.
and again, parties of like house parties, street parties are all very popular. And the interesting thing about Israel is the day before it celebrates its independence, it remembers those who died to preserve its independence. Immediately before Israeli Independence Day is the observance of Yom HaZikaron, which is Memorial Day for fallen soldiers and security personnel, as well as victims of terrorism. And military families visit their loved ones who were killed in action in military cemeteries throughout the country. And I've been to one of these military cemeteries, the biggest one, Mount Herzl in Jerusalem. And there are a number of interesting graves in there. One of them is actually an American soldier, an American lone soldier who killed in action serving in the Israeli army. His name was Michael Levine, and he was killed during Israel's second war with Lebanon in 2006. And his grave.
Let me ask you something about that. So speaking of the state of Israel and just in general Jewish people, are there Orthodox Jews in Israel also?
Yes, there are. There are all sorts of Jews. There's the ultra Orthodox. There's the conservative movement, the Reform movement. They all have a presence in Israel. The ultra Orthodox generally control Jewish life cycle events. So they control things like marriage, burials. They control, as of right now, although there is a push to change that, they control certifying dining establishments as being kosher for Jews who observe kashrut, which is Jewish dietary law. They control things like that. They also control conversions, and that's at times is a controversial topic. I actually have a friend of mine who lives in southern Israel now. He had to go through a huge battle with the Interior Ministry of Israel to get his conversion recognized, even though the rabbinate recognized his conversion as being authentic and abiding by Jewish law.
So let me ask you that then. So I want to move. Generally, the show, I talk with people about their conservative journey and just about about conservatism in the United States. But one demographic group that has been stubbornly faithful to Democrats here in the United States is the Jewish voters. So historically, liberal, most Jewish Americans have long voted Democrat. Why is that? Because when we find, the Republican Party has been extraordinarily supportive of Israel and issues that are important to the Jewish community. So why do you think that?
I think it dates back to when Jews first started coming to America in large numbers, and especially coming into Ellis Island in New York City. And of course, there was the big Democrat political machine, Tammany Hall in Manhattan. And so Tammany Hall, that big political machine, got a hold of a lot of Jewish immigrants coming into New York and convinced them to register with the Democrat Party. And that has continued on through the generations. So I call this phenomenon the ghosts of Tammany Hall.
Okay. And even now, after all these years, I mean, when Trump was in office, as you know, he moved the embassy to Jerusalem. He negotiated that, the peace talks.
The Abraham Accords.
Right, right. So, but we're still seeing in large numbers Jewish Americans do vote Democrat.
Yes, and I it's a struggle for me to figure out as well, especially in light of how we've seen how the Democrat Party openly embraces I'll call them what they are. They're openly raging anti-Semites in Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, who traffic in anti-Semitic tropes, who also engage in demonizing and delegitimizing the state of Israel. They support the boycott, divest, sanctions movement, which the Trump administration declared as anti-Semitic in 2019 and 2020. And I don't understand how any self-respecting Jew with any conscience can support a party that embraces politicians like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. Mm-hmm. Honestly, it shows the lack of integrity in House leadership that the Democrats majority, led by Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer from Southern Maryland, don't even have the spine to expel them from the House for their anti-Semitism, because that would send a very loud and clear message to the House and to the American people that anti-Semitism will not be tolerated in the people's house. And yet it is, because any resolution to censure them for their anti-Semitism is watered down by the rest of the Democrat caucus and essentially renders those censure resolutions meaningless.
Yeah. I want to talk about, we have some comments here. So we have Evie Harris says, just like many blacks were raised to be Democrats, just because, so it is with many Jews, except the Orthodox or Hasidic Jews, that may be changing somewhat too. So I guess she was responding to what you said about the Jewish community and the Democrat Party. One thing Trump said, I think this was back in 2020, he says, and I want to get your response. He says the Jewish people in the United States either don't like Israel or don't care about Israel. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, this is especially pronounced in younger generations. So people, young Jews around my age, they don't have as strong a connection to Israel as our parents did, their parents and grandparents. And I really can't help but wonder if the liberal orthodoxy of demonizing Israel on university campuses has something to do with that. I read a survey. I read a survey recently. There was a report about this that was published in the Jerusalem Post about how nearly a quarter of Jewish millennials feel that they have to hide their connection to Israel or distance themselves from Israel and hide their Jewish identity in order to fit in with their peers. That to me is incredibly disturbing, that the climate on America's university campuses is so hostile to Jews that they feel they have to deny connections to Israel or conceal their identity. I mean, I'm sitting here, I'm wearing 2 Star of David necklaces. I mean, generally I don't always wear these openly, but because I have to keep my head on a swivel because of the increasingly anti-Semitic climate that we're seeing here in America. I mean, just look at New York City. It seems like Orthodox Jews are being assaulted up there on a daily basis.
Well, you're right. I mean, the Anti-Defamation League reports that the state has led the nation in anti-Semitic incidents in 2021 with a 24% jump over 2020. And I think this was recently, they had legislation they derailed legislation to open up the Holocaust history, teach Holocaust history in New York public schools. So, I mean, we're seeing this, and as you mentioned, this is where, most people, the Jewish community came in, and New York City is just filled with anti-Semitic rhetoric.
Yes, and it sickens me. And we saw the same thing also in 2019, where Orthodox Jews were assaulted in Brooklyn on a seemingly daily basis. Mm-hmm. And I don't know why this is, but it seemed like almost all the attackers, or at least the ones that were caught on video, for whatever reason, were African American. So that's not to say, of course, that all blacks are anti-Semitic, but I think enough are that it is an issue that needs to be highlighted, spotlighted, and addressed accordingly. And there were a number of incidents in 2019 and even through so far this year. Orthodox Jewish women either walking with their young children or pushing their toddlers and strollers and just getting attacked and accosted for who knows what reason other than walking down a street in Crown Heights or Borough Park.
Right. Yeah, it's a sad state of events. And when, like you mentioned, we have a very anti-Jewish climate, and the numbers show it really skyrocketed under President Obama, where these anti-Semitic acts and hate crimes started to rise. So it's a very sad state of events there. And, the rhetoric that's pushed in Congress by people like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and other members of the squad don't help the climate either. Why?
No, they don't. They don't. Not when we have the likes of Cori Bush saying that police officers that Israel is teaching police officers to kill blacks when they go to Israel, and there are a lot of police officers from a number of cities who've gone to Israel for counterterrorism training, a lot from New York, even from her district of St. Louis, and somehow to conflate going to Israel for counterterrorism training equals learning how to racially profile and kill blacks. But no, it does not make sense. Representative Bush, how about you address the fact that your district is so rife with crime that, like here in Baltimore, the population is shrinking because people are getting concerned about the crime and they're moving out. St. Louis has been shrinking for I don't even know how many years. Again, like Baltimore, and what's the majority of the crime there? It's black on black crime. It's black men shooting other black men, like here in Baltimore, like in Memphis.
Right.
And
I want to get this comment here. Again, Evie Harris says, I've said this before, we cannot rely on government, schools, and bureaucracy to teach our values and history. It starts at home. And that's a good point. One thing I would like to ask is, I think the biggest solution, or the biggest solution to any type of hate crime and aggressiveness between the cultures, between races, is for them to come together. It's for people to reach out to people of other ethnicities, other religions, and form bonds. You as the treasurer of the Maryland Republican Jewish Council, what have you guys done to make inroads within the Black community? Because we do see this antagonistic.
Well, two of our members are Black. Our secretary is Nicole Bennett, who is the president of the Maryland Black Republican Council, and another also a member of that council is our chairwoman, Marie Fisher. So Marie Fisher, and I'm sure you had her. I know you had her on Pop and Politics back in January with former Mayor Sheila Dixon, and yes, I have my popcorn ready for that. Marie converted to Judaism, so she is a combination of both worlds, Black and Jewish. And of course, I know KJ, I'm sure you're a student of Black history here in America. Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. That movement would not have accomplished as much as it did without the support of the American Jewish community. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a leading rabbi in the conservative Jewish movement, he was the face of the Jewish support for the civil rights movement. He marched with MLK down in Selma, Alabama in 1965. And in fact, one of his contemporaries, who was a former rabbi of mine when I lived in Maine, his name was Rabbi Harry Skye of blessed memory. He also marched with his mentor, Rabbi Heschel, and Martin Luther King in Selma. So again, it pains me to see how much the relationship between Blacks and Jews have deteriorated since the civil rights movement, to the point where there is an element in Black America that is anti-Semitic. And perhaps the most egregious example of that, the most concerning example of that, is the Black Lives Matter movement. Anti-Semitism is very much a part of the core of the Black Lives Matter movement. They even listed it as part of their platform. That Jews are white oppressors, and that the state of Israel, they slander the state of Israel as being an illegitimate colonialist project and an apartheid state. Of course, earlier this year, we had that controversial report from Amnesty International, among other organizations, declaring Israel an apartheid state, and it's just not true. It is not grounded in reality.
Why is this perpetuated? Where is this coming from? Why is this narrative perpetuated on the left? And the left is predominantly, blacks are predominantly on the left, in the Democrat Party. And so it's perpetuated throughout that. And then, of course, you have a large amount of black people that hear this and they do start to believe it. So where is this coming from?
I'm really not sure. I mean, let's start with this. The state of Israel has a very tense relationship with the Palestinian territories. So Judea and Samaria, which is to the east of Jerusalem, it's Judea and Samaria to Jews, and more commonly known as the West Bank, or the occupied West Bank, which is really a misnomer. And then there's the Gaza Strip in the southwest of Israel, which is ruled by the terrorist organization Hamas. And Israel, just since Hamas took over Gaza back in 2007, Israel and Hamas have fought 4 wars in that time. Operation Cast Lead, Operation Pillar of Defense, and Operation Protective Edge, and most recently, just last year, we're actually coming up on the 1-year anniversary of this, Operation Guardian of the Walls. And this has been to stop Hamas terrorists from violating the border and trying to carry out attacks in Israel, and also rocket attacks. So Israel has to, as Bill Maher of all people put it, they have to keep a lid on the situation or they get killed. And as I mentioned earlier, it's been happening again in Israel since the middle of March. 16 Israelis and 2 foreign nationals have been killed in terrorist attacks in Israel since the middle of March. That was more than the number of people killed in Israel by Hamas's rocket attacks during Operation Guardian of the Walls last year. And so Israel is exercising its sacred right, its most important responsibility to its citizens as a sovereign and democratic nation, to protect its citizens. So that means tightly controlling who's crossing its borders to come in and out of the country. And for the Palestinians, working in Israel is how a lot of them make their livings, because Hamas certainly isn't developing an economy. The Palestinian Authority isn't developing an economy. In fact, the Palestinian Authority pays its citizens 5 times more to kill Jews than they can get paid working. So that is pay for slay.
Yeah, and I listen to Ben Shapiro almost every day. He's one of my favorite people to listen to, as far as on the conservative side. And he talks about, I can't remember the name of the sacred place in Israel, but he talks about this is a place where people go, and he says how they, it's not just Jews that are there, it's Muslims, they are invited there. So he talks about how, in that area, Muslims and people who practice Islam are invited into these Jewish territories, but Jews cannot go into these Muslim territories. Is that correct?
And I think that might be the Temple Mount in the Temple Mount in the old city in Jerusalem. So the Temple Mount, it's known as Har Habayit in Hebrew, the Temple Mount, and Haram al-Sharif in Arabic. So that's the home to what in biblical times was the site of the 2 temples, King David's temple and King Solomon's temple, and also one of the holiest sites in Islam, the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. So Jews are not allowed to pray on what is one of their holiest sites, the Temple Mount, and beneath that, the Western Wall. But Muslims are allowed to go up there and pray at their holy site. And that, as you've seen, KJ, has been a huge flashpoint over the last probably 6 weeks. Mm-hmm. Every night, seemingly during Ramadan, there were riots at the Al-Aqsa Mosque and outside the Damascus Gate, where rioters were throwing bricks and stones and even explosives, not only at the police, Israeli police and border police, but even on Jewish worshippers down below at the Western Wall. They were one night during Passover a couple of weeks ago, worshippers were getting pelted with firecrackers.
Yeah, but what the ironic thing that he would mention is that this area is a place where Muslims come, but it's guarded by Jews, so the Israelis. So it's just like the Israelis are allowing this to, these Muslims to come and worship, and they're guarding it, but they're not given the same. They're not treated the same way. Is what I'm saying.
And that has been the status quo on the Temple Mount that we've heard about, and it has been in place since Israel and Jordan signed the Oslo Accords back in 1994. This was back when King Abdullah's father, King Hussein, was still alive, and he signed that peace agreement with late Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who ultimately ended up getting assassinated for signing that agreement. Mm-hmm. And that the Jordanian Waqf is the organization that controls the Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem. And that was part of the Oslo Accords. And yet at the same time, the state of Israel guarantees freedom of worship for all faiths who live in Israel. Mm-hmm. Judaism, Islam, Christianity, Baha'i, and Druze. Those are the biggest faiths that live in Israel, and they are all guaranteed freedom to practice their respective religions.
But can you do this in Palestine? Can you do this?
Well, let's see. Since 2005, there have been no Jews who have lived in Gaza. Israel unilaterally pulled its citizens out of Gaza in 2005, and I would argue that's been a colossal mistake because Hamas took that over in 2007 and has used that as a base for launching terrorist attacks along with their partners, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad.
Okay. We have an interesting comment here. So let's see here. What's the homicide rate in Israel? It's a very interesting contrast to see how the Jewish people respond to attacks on their people versus what we see in Baltimore City. Okay,
well,
can you respond to that? Mm-hmm.
There is an issue actually in Israel's Arab communities, their Arab cities. The Arab population in Israel is approximately 22%. So not an insignificant minority at all. More than one out of every 5 Israeli citizens are Muslim Arabs. And there's been an issue over the last few years with a high homicide rate in those communities. And there's been criticism of the Israel police for not doing more to tamp down on that violence. Now, the commenter here says, in terms of how Jewish people respond to attacks on their people versus what we see in Baltimore City. Well, the heart of the Jewish community in Baltimore is Upper Park Heights. So that's the stretch generally of Green Spring Avenue and Park Heights Avenue north of Northern Parkway. And in Upper Park Heights, since May of last year, there have been a number of serious incidents in that neighborhood. Again, a large ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in Northwest Baltimore. Since that time, there has been a murder. There was Ephraim Gordon who this time last year, came to visit for a family wedding and was gunned down in cold blood on the front steps of his aunt and uncle's house. And since then, there's also been an attempted murder where a 17-year-old at the time was shot in the head and seriously wounded. There have also been, just this year alone, 2 carjackings, one of which was armed. And then just a couple weeks ago, there was a shootout and an attempted dirt bike theft, where a dirt bike jacking, I guess you call it, because someone was.
I saw that, yeah.
And there was surveillance video that from Marie's synagogue. She shared that footage with me, and that was a wild scene. That was on a Sunday afternoon, 3:00 in the afternoon, and nonsense like that is happening in the middle of Upper Park Heights. Mm-hmm. That tells me that the policies of Marilyn Mosby and Brandon Scott have failed and are allowing violent crime to move into parts of the city that don't usually see violent crime. I mentioned the murder of Ephraim Gordon. That was the first murder in Upper Park Heights in over 50 years.
Wow.
So, up until recently, stuff like that just didn't happen up there.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's to make headlines. That should make the news.
It is making headlines. In fact, the trial of one of the people who've been charged in the murder of Ephraim Gordon, that was scheduled to start actually on Monday. It's since been postponed to November because the defendant wanted to hire private counsel. And another one of the attackers actually just entered a guilty plea. It's not clear what the third person who was charged, the other two were juveniles at the time, and there's a fourth suspect who's still at large. So it's not clear out of the three who were arrested what the third one, what the status of that case is. But we have one guilty plea and one trial that's now scheduled to begin in November.
So let me ask you something. This is something that's always puzzled me about the Jewish community. So, I'm Christian. And, you have the Jewish community. Jews are descendants. Your lineage goes back, it's from the beginning of time. Why would a Jewish person choose not to follow Torah, to choose not to practice your religion? I never understand it. I like Orthodox Jews. I'm in awe. Like but why would a Jewish person choose not to do that? And this is your culture. This is who you are. I'm always confused by that.
I think a lot of it is a matter of personal preference, but in some cases, I actually saw there was an article about this a couple months ago. There's actually a synagogue, I think it's a more liberal synagogue in Chicago, that the members had a vote and decided to declare themselves anti-Zionist, meaning they don't believe that the state of Israel should have the right to exist as a Jewish and democratic state where its citizens of all faiths can determine its destiny. So that even goes that I don't use the word heretic very often, but I think that is incredibly heretical of Jews to engage to make a statement like that. Why would, especially since look at how often Israel and Jerusalem are mentioned in the Torah, in Jewish liturgy. It's mentioned constantly. Jerusalem is mentioned 669 times in the Torah. It's not mentioned once in the Quran.
Oh, okay. Okay, yeah, that's something I've always wanted to know. And what is Zionist? When you said that? What does that mean?
The Zionist movement was founded by a man named Theodor Herzl, who was from Hungary, and he had a vision in the early 20th century about the Jewish people who've been in exile since the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in the year 70. And so his vision was that the Jews would be able to return in a state of their own, a political state of their own. And
isn't that something to do with the bloodline, though? And this is another question I have. When you talk about being Jewish and in the bloodline, how can you have conversion? That I don't understand how that even would work if it's within your bloodline.
Well, that's for people who were born and raised Jewish, but people can convert to Judaism. But it is a long process. It does take a few years and involves a lot of studying.
But is it a true conversion?
Yes, it is. There's a ritual process for it, and one of it involves being immersed in what's known as a mikveh, which is a pool of naturally sourced spring water that is used for ritual purification.
Okay. I always was curious about that. Okay. All right. Well, one thing I wanted to just talk about also, because we are almost at the time, we're at the end of our time. is what you mentioned, the biggest misconception about Judaism, which is Jewish people own everything, they own the world, they're rich. Do you know the data behind that? Because it's a huge misconception. Is there data that backs that up, and do you happen to know that?
I don't happen to know that data, and there isn't really data to back that up. But yet, Ilhan Omar, as she was running for Congress, put out a tweet about that, saying, Jews control the world, and it's all about the Benjamins, baby, and she, she was referring to the American Israel Public Affairs Committee when she tweeted that. And again, these are anti-Semitic tropes that have been used to justify violence against Jews for centuries, millennia even.
Right. And I wish someone would push back and really, because I'm a data person, and just being, African American and understanding how certain narratives are pushed, and then when you go look at the data, just like crime statistics, just like the police police statistics, when you go to look at this data, it doesn't match the narrative that's being pushed. So I would just love to know the data, behind that, where are they getting this from, and refute it with that.
Well, I can say that Jews are there are a number of Jews obviously who practice fields like medicine and law. Those are fields that earn much higher than the median income and the average income of the population. Other similar professions as well, such as accounting,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think that necessarily means that we make enough money to peddle influence, control the world, control the weather, as one DC city councilman posted on social media a couple years ago, and proceeded to get a rash of blowback about that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I mean, are we successful in certain professions? Yes. Does that mean we control the world or rule the world, and or are the puppet masters pulling the strings behind the curtain? No.
Okay. All right. Well, one thing that I would like to do is, like you mentioned, definitely increase the connections between the Jewish community and the Black community. So, especially here in Baltimore, because as you mentioned, we have a long history of in civil rights and so on and so forth. So, can you just talk about what are some ways, or do you have any ideas how we can do that here locally?
Well, there is one program actually that kind of does this, and it's bears the name of a longtime late congressman who represented Baltimore in the House for over 20 years, the Elijah Cummings Youth Program.
Mm-hmm.
That is a program that teaches young Black men, often teenagers, teaches them leadership skills. And as part of that program, they actually go on a trip to Israel to interact with the different cultures in Israel: Black, Israeli Jews, Israeli Arabs, etc. So that's part of that trip. And it disturbs me that movements like Black Lives Matter, which was founded by Marxists,
Right.
Black Lives Matter, if they had their way, they would probably dismantle programs like that. And that would be to the detriment of the young men and women who are enrolled in programs like that. So we already have a program like that. To answer your question, KJ, we already have a program like that here in Baltimore, and it was started by the late Elijah Cummings. And that was in recognition of the fact that there are large Black and Jewish communities in Baltimore, and it was an effort to get them to work together.
Okay. All right. Well, definitely want to go to some of the comments before I let you go here. So I have here, let's see. David Bond, Evie Harris, I will admit that I failed to educate my children.
Okay, so that was someone who probably if he wanted to didn't want to homeschool his children because, well, he probably didn't think he could do a good job of it.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then we have another here, Evie Harris. As far as these stereotypes, there may not be data per se, but centuries of oral history, pieces of actual history, traditions, experiences, beliefs, superstitions, etc. Data is not always in number of quantitative form. There is qualitative form too.
And
Okay.
that probably is the basis of these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, blood libels. They're just based on oral history and not really anything, as Evie says, quantitative.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, we are at the end of our time. Where can people find more about the Maryland Republican Jewish Council and anything that you would like to share before we end tonight?
Maryland Republican Jewish Council is on Facebook and Instagram, and I post it. I record a daily video series on there called the Daily Kvetch, and that I usually post videos pretty much every day, with the exception of Jewish holidays. And so you can find me there, giving my takes on latest issues of the day. I'll be posting a kvetch later tonight about Israel Independence Day, and actually about a recent vote by the student government, or excuse me, the editorial board at the Harvard Crimson, voting to endorse the boycott, divest, sanction movement in the same breath as also approving a resolution opposing anti-Semitism. And how basically, yeah, they approved both of them essentially in the same breath. So you can support one or the other, but not both. They are mutually exclusive. They do not jive. You cannot endorse BDS and oppose anti-Semitism at the same time, because BDS is anti-Semitic, which includes anti-Zionist.
Okay. All right. Well, certainly we'll post the links to your to those broadcasts. And that wraps up this episode of the 830 show. We are all over social media under Metro Conservatives Media. So like, share, and leave a comment, and follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter. Also, check us out on the web at www.metroconservativemedia.com. We love to get your feedback. I hope to connect with you again next Thursday at the same time. Wishing you warm days and starry nights. Good night.